Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of RM Sotheby's Car Show, and this is a bonus episode, this is a special episode after I'd caught up with Sam Hancock, historic racer, well known for being a historic racer, but also a guy that's driven factory cars at Le Mans, got an amazing CV, and I caught up with him at our London auction in early November, and we had a really fascinating chat about everything historic and motorsport related. I think you're going to find a lot of interest, so sit back and enjoy the conversation with Sam. Welcome, Sam. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The reason we've asked Sam, if you're not familiar with Sam, which is hard to imagine anyone would be familiar with you and your career, Sam, but Sam has had a really successful career at the peak of Le Mans and GT racing. You were European Le Mans champion in 2004?
Literally decades ago, yeah.
Very 2004.
Yeah.
Less grey in your hair back then, you know. No, but Sam, have had, joking aside, you've had a great career, and so let's just rewind a little bit. Let's go back to little Sam, 10-year-old Sam.
Yeah.
Sort of where did it all start?
I can sum that up pretty quickly. It was the classic story of growing up with motor racing very much in our household, because my dad has always raced for fun, for a hobby, initially in classic Formula Ford 2000. Well, it wasn't classic when he was doing it, it was just Formula Ford 2000. And I just grew up from the age of probably 0 going to a racetrack every other weekend, Liddon Hill, Brands Hatch, Mallory Park, Cadwell, wherever it was, just to watch Dad. And I just grew up around these race cars, loved it for as far back as my memory goes. And there's countless pictures of me sitting in the cars at various ages, desperately trying to see if I can see over the top of the steering wheel or reach the pedals, which ironically went on to become absolutely not a problem, except that it was too easy to reach the pedals and I'm too tall for my chosen career. But no, I just remember only ever wanting to race, and that was it. There was never anything else out there for me. And when I finally was tall enough to reach the pedals of Dad's kart, which stood up against a wall in the shed, we went off to Blackbush, but not to the circuit itself, to the sort of redundant airfield next door, which had some very bumpy tarmac runways that you could put a 6-year-old kid into without a helmet and bump start a 100cc two-stroke kart and sort of roll the dice and see what happens. And I just loved it from that first moment, and started racing cadet karts at I think 8 or 9 years old, and never looked back.
So when you first got into a kart, were you instantly competitive, or, you know, how hard did you have to work at it?
I think the very first race I ever did was an indoor karting event at Playscape Racing, which was one of the first in the country, I think. Yeah. And I tagged along, and Dad and I had sort of had this pre-event briefing about how to blag my way in, because I was super underage. I mean, I wasn't racing cadets at this time, so I was reasonably tall, I think, for my age, and somehow they let me in. I was in Dad's massive racing leathers. It didn't fit, you know, drowning in those. For whatever reason, they let me race. I was probably 8 years old, perhaps, and the structure I remember was a couple of heats and maybe a semi-final and a final or something. And I was appalling in the heats. I think I finished bog last both times, and I vividly remember being so pissed off about that. And I watched what everyone else was doing, and suddenly the concept of a racing line kind of just sort of appeared in my brain. I sort of got a sense of that they're turning in from over there and cutting into there. Okay, let's try that. And I didn't win the final, but whatever I got through to, I won the race of all the losers, the worst people. But I won that, so I went home happy.
I'm very familiar with that.
First of the losers. Yeah, exactly. So actually that was when it started to click. And I was very lucky that in the years that followed, Dad actually opened an indoor kart track of his own in Weybridge, imaginatively called go-karting. And I cannot imagine how many hundreds, maybe even thousands of hours I must have spent going round and round in circles from the age probably of, I don't know, 10 to 14 or something there, and just every spare moment was spent there.
So what he's saying is he cheated because he had his own
It was a real, rags to riches story of, He's really impoverished his own kart track. It's a tough one.
Well, it's the same for Schumacher. He had his own kart track as well,
Yes,
didn't he?
yeah.
So Schumacher family.
It did help.
Yeah.
It did help. Well, it wasn't very helpful when you had to sort of clean up at the end of a massive corporate session with 60 or so people on a night out, and they just destroyed all the tyre barriers. They're littered across the whole warehouse, and carts in all sorts of pieces. But there were a few fun things. There weren't many indoor kart tracks around in whatever year this was, 1990-ish, and so you would attract, especially being down in Weybridge in Surrey, which is near McLaren. Obviously there's a bit of a Formula One hub around there, so every now and again you'd get some real superstars along. I remember we did some charity event and Christian Fittipaldi turned up, and all I wanted to do was beat him, and by this time I'd done thousands of laps, so I was actually reasonably quick, and I remember being livid because Herbie Blash nerfed me off into the barriers when I was lapping him, and I lost what I felt was this really important win, which of course it wasn't important.
So Fittipaldi won?
He did. He walked it.
It's interesting. Karting is an established way into the sport for a lot of the guys we obviously see on Formula One grids have over the decades come through karting. How much of it is relevant, and how much of what you learn in a kart then ultimately does transfer to proper cars on proper tracks? I mean, do you think that it's still the most sensible way to get into high-level motorsport?
I think it is absolutely critical for anyone that is serious about wanting to race at a very high level. I cannot think of a better way to develop the muscle memory and the sort of almost that sort of instinct, that nervous system reaction that we all, when we're racing, we rely on without really thinking about it. And the more laps you can do in a kart as a kid, when all of that stuff's developing so efficiently anyway, the easier it's going to be further down the road. I mean, one of the ways I make my living these days is as a private driver coach, so I'm dealing with a lot of people that are coming to the sport very late in life, and the difference is enormous. I mean, it's I don't know if I can imagine it being similar to trying to learn to ski at 40 or 50 years old. Really hard, but put a 5 or 6 year old on a pair of skis and they just go and they sort of figure it out. And it's the same, I think, in karting. Your backside gets used to the feel of tyres sliding across the surface. Your right foot gets used to balancing that slide on the throttle. It's all hyper responsive. Funny enough, my brother Ollie does a ton of karting these days, and I'm almost a bit afraid to go back out there and have a go, because on the odd occasion that I have, I'm so bad at it. Terrible, like truly appalling and embarrassingly bad, because you forget how precise you need to be, and not just in terms of placing the kart on the apex, but in terms of perfect brake pressure at just the right moment with just the right steering input at that time for the rolling speed and the grip available. And if you get it wrong, which can be the difference of in pedal travel on the brake, it might be a millimetre or less, and the rear axle locks and you spun off into the bush and you look like a wally, and that has been me lately, and it takes some time to kind of brush the cobwebs away and dial back into it.
Physically hard work, isn't it? I did a karting thing 4 or 5 years ago with a bunch of significantly younger people, and I've never felt my age more than that day. I was dying in my back, my arms, my shoulders. I'm just unfit, but but it is a very physical sport, isn't it?
Well, actually, I'm pleased you mentioned it, because I was just thinking I really need to kind of pull my finger out and get back on my training this winter. And most training is boring, but actually karting is a fantastic way to get race fit very quickly, and genuinely, like that, it is, as you say, it's physically really hard. It's easy to get beaten up. You do have to be careful. I once, in fact, prior to what I would probably say was my biggest year ever racing at Le Mans, I went karting a couple of weeks before, sort of trying to do a bit of training, and karting was part of it. And literally about 10 days before racing an LMP1 car for Aston Martin at Le Mans, I managed to fracture a rib in a kart, and I think it's the first time I've probably told anyone about that, because the team certainly didn't know. I just remember going through the last hours of that year's Le Mans, just bloody agony.
Well,
every time I turn through a right-hander.
We're going to come back to Le Mans, because obviously that's an absolute sort of, peak objective for anyone that gets into the sport. Everyone wants to go to do Le Mans. I mean, if you don't become a Formula One driver and go off and do the Monaco Grand Prix, Le Mans is the race that everyone wants to do. So we're definitely going to be talking more about that. But just quickly, at what point? So you've grown up in a motorsport family. You're doing all this karting from a really young age. At what point did you stop trying to work hard at school to pass any exams because you were saying to yourself, I don't need to learn algebra because I'm going to be a racing driver? Was there a point at which you thought, I think I'm sufficiently good at this that I might be able to make a living at it? Or were your parents saying, Sam, get your exams, do your A-levels, go to university, be sensible?
Well, they definitely were saying all of that, and it drove me absolutely mad because, of course, you're looking, you're glued to Formula One every other weekend. You're reading Autosport magazine, Autosport, Karting magazine, Motorsport magazine were cover-to-cover reads for me every edition, and you're learning about the stories, the trajectories of the guys who have made it to Formula One, and often they're coming into karting at 8 years old or younger, and they're coming out of karting into F3 even for the really good ones at sort of 16 years old. And of course you think, well, that's what I want to do. I don't need any of this school, I just want to go racing, and actually I need to do more racing. And though I don't want to be selected not that I was ever going to get selected for the first 11 of any kind of ball sports at school, but they always find a way to shoehorn you into a D team or whatever it is, which means a match on the Sunday and all this stuff. So half of my life was spent trying to wriggle out of things like that so that I could go racing and testing. And the other half was kind of, just trying to placate mum and dad's encouragement, shall we say, to stay focused enough on school. I mean, I think I probably did try to blag a good few excuses about why school doesn't make sense and I should just go racing full time from about 14 or 15 years old.
Did you go to university?
Didn't go to university, no. They were very clear with me, and thank God. They said, look, you don't have to go to uni, we'd like you to, but you definitely have to get your A-levels. So obviously, that meant keeping my head down through GCSEs and A-levels. But I was racing by then, and I think I had a race the day after my last A-level, actually, off the top of my head, which was really hard to ignore when you're trying to write this bloody essay.
So you'd gone through various karting formulas. Then sort of, what happened then? Sort of you went, what formulas were you moving to, or championships?
Just to be crystal clear, in karting, I was never, the next Lewis Hamilton or Jenson Button or whatever. I didn't have the talent, and I definitely didn't have the stature, the physique for it. I was too tall and too heavy, which is a big deal in karting. And what would happen is every time I moved up to the next category for the older kids, I would be briefly on the weight limit for about 6 months, and then I'd get a few trophies and sort of tell myself, okay, I might be able to do this. But I was very lucky because Dad raced, and so he had his 1982 Van Diemen single-seater, which was classic Formula 4 2000 race car, which the rules changed as I was in my sort of early teens, and suddenly 16-year-olds were allowed to get a race car license.
Yeah.
And we thought that was quite fun, and the Van Diemen was there. They're not valuable cars, they're very cheap to run, but they are brilliant to drive. 2-litre engine, slicks and wings, space frame chassis, proper things. So at 16, I was allowed to go and race that for the season, and it was a very clubby environment, and I definitely had some learning to do, and that transition from karts to cars was weird. I remember just thinking, nothing makes sense, how are you supposed to do this? But I figured it out reasonably quickly, and once I started sort of getting some trophies at that level, then we plotted a path up through single-seaters, Vauxhall Junior, and then into Formula Palmer Audi, which was a single-make, cost-capped version of Formula Renault, and it was sort of
they did a winter series on that as well, didn't they?
Winter series. Yeah. But Formula Palmer Audi was really key for my career because it was full of guys that went on to do big things. Darren Turner, who's now Le Mans winner with Aston Martin and teammate of mine. He was doing it. Justin Wilson, who got to Formula One and IndyCar. Robbie Kerr, who It was, A1 GP and sports car stars, Damien Faulkner, big Porsche, Super Cup race winner, and all sorts of people passed through that were really good. And it's quite interesting to look around the paddocks today and see a bunch of pros still earning their living, still operating at a high level of the sport. And we all sort of came out of that, and it was a really hard proving ground because every car was identical, and you had limited things that you could change on the setup. You basically just had to drive it better than everybody else. And again, I wasn't good enough to be a championship contender, but I did win a few races. I did get a few podiums. I was sort of a top 5 kind of a guy, and that was enough to give momentum, at least enthusiasm, and justify trying to move up the ladder. But then you go from needing to find circa 100 grand a year, and you're looking at Formula 3, which at the time was £500,000 a year, and then you're looking at Formula 3000, which was double that, and it just became a complete mess.
Yeah.
And I had a few wrong turns, bouncing between different categories. I moved to the States for 5 minutes and tried to make it out there, and that's probably a bit too much fun was had, if I'm honest, living in Miami at the time, 20 years old. But
that's a whole area we're not going to go
That's another
into.
episode.
That's probably for an after hours podcast. Yeah. But eventually, in a useful way, multiple crunch points were reached where the season was starting without me. I didn't have any money, I didn't have a seat in anything, I didn't know really what to do. It just sort of forces the issue, and one thing that I did do was pivot to sports car racing very early, and for what felt like pennies, you could blag your way into a sports car seat at a very high level. And for me, in 2001, I was 21, I got a seat with Kramer Racing in what was then the equivalent to today's sort of LMP1 cars. And I found myself paired up with XF1 drivers like Jean-Marc Gounon, factory Mercedes driver, factory...
How did that feel? Did you feel under a lot of pressure? I mean, if you're pairing with a driver that's operated at that level, you must feel like you've really got to step up.
Yeah, I had no idea what to expect. I couldn't conceive what the car was going to be like to drive. All I knew is that guys I'd raced against, like Alan Simonson and Formula Palmeraldi and various guys, they had done this move already the year or two before, and they had done very well. And I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that my buddy from the junior single-seater categories was in a 650 horsepower Judd V10 screaming beautiful, what was then SR1 prototype. But I figured if they could do it, then I might be able to. And the useful thing about being paired with known quantities like Jean-Marc, who was coming out of F1, or Ralph Kelleners, who was a factory Toyota GT1 driver just a year or two before, is you had a direct benchmark. You knew if you're any good or not. And actually I was fine. I paired up really well against those guys very quickly. And definitely they had loads more experience, and there were things that they were significantly better than me at. But what an opportunity to learn.
Yeah.
I mean, what an extraordinary chance to sit in a debrief with an engineer and hear somebody of that level explain how they find the car to be behaving, what they recommend doing. It was quite something.
Yeah, amazing. You'd sort of crossed a threshold where you had sort of left single-seaters and the associated budgets, and you'd found your way into sports cars, which is great, and that makes complete sense to me. So, what year was your first Le Mans?
2002 maybe, can't remember.
20 years ago.
It didn't last very long.
20 years ago. I know one or two people that have done Le Mans, and they all have different stories, different anecdotes, and I think probably the experience is different for everyone, and I think it's got an awful lot to do with the car you're in and the support you're getting and all the rest of it. But I mean, if you could best summarise the Le Mans experience, not necessarily the first year you did it, but if somebody sort of says to you, okay, Sam, in a minute, tell me what Le Mans is like to do, how would you kind of summarise that?
Well, I had two distinctly different types of experiences of racing at Le Mans 8 times, can't remember now. And the first half of those visits, I was having to scrabble together money to buy the seat. Now, it's not the kind of hundreds of thousands terrifying telephone numbers that it is today. In fact, one year we did a deal for I think about 12 grand or something to be in a great car at Le Mans. But I had to wear my marketing hat rather than my crash helmet for at least 6 months before that, which meant that when I got to Le Mans, there was so much responsibility to anyone that had pitched in. If they were private people, friends, family, whatever, you didn't want to let them down. If they were commercial sponsors, they were often on site with VIP guests in some hospitality booth. I needed to make sure their stickers were in the right place. I needed to make sure that all my racewear was branded up properly. I needed to make sure that all the stupid email newsletters, everything was going well, the hospitality was good, that if anyone had any preferences about food or drink, there was, and I wasn't able to think about the car and the race. And so I found those years, don't get me wrong, I was thrilled to be there, but I distinctly remember
Quite
standing,
stressful.
it's stressful, and I just standing in the garage with all these the thoughts of the commercial responsibilities going through my head rather than the bit about the car, and I hated that so much, and I really envied other competitors that didn't have to think about that stuff. But it did turn out to be a really good way to learn about what it takes to turn into a pro driver and learn about marketing and learn about motorsport from a commercial perspective. So I don't begrudge it, and I needed to go through it, but wow, did things improve when I finally managed to tip the balance of the seesaw in the opposite direction and be there as a paid professional. Suddenly the whole thing was just magical, because you felt justified. You didn't feel like you were blagging it and that you were kind of you blagged your way into something that you maybe shouldn't be doing, even though I was always pretty good actually, and my pace was fine, and I ended up feeling that I could pull the visor down and leave all of those sponsor related concerns behind me as soon as we left the pit lane and do actually a pretty good job. But just to go back because the team really wants you to the point where they've picked you, and you're not being paid a lot, don't get me wrong, but even if they're paying your expenses or something, you just feel like, fantastic, I'm here, I'm the nominated pro in the lineup, I'm the lead driver, I'm doing the setup, I'm doing the qualifying attempt, I'm starting the race. And you would think that those responsibilities feel more pressurized, but actually I found it the complete opposite. It was just pure fantastic racing joy. I loved it.
Of the 7 or 8 times you've done Le Mans, what's your best result has been?
They're all the same. DNF.
I've
never got to the sodding
I think
checkered flag.
That's mechanical sympathy, Michael.
Probably. No, it's brutal. I hate it so much. It just kills me. It absolutely kills me. The closest I got was the year that was the most significant, and I sound like a washed up old racing driver with the same story on a repeat, like a broken record, but it was a special year. I was with Aston Martin when they had the beautiful Golf liveried LMP1 coupes, and that was my first time with a big factory team, and it wasn't a high budget team. We were up against a brace of diesel Peugeots, a brace of diesel Audis. We were never gonna do anything better than, the best case scenario would have been 6th, first petrol powered car home. This was in 2010. But it was great because I had guys like Darren Turner as my teammate, so again another benchmarking opportunity, and he's so easy and brilliant to work with. He's such a lovely laid back guy that you're not navigating any weird intra-team politics or anything, but there's definitely expectation to perform, and I hadn't experienced a team that was quite so brutally frank and serious. Nobody seemed to be there for fun. It was incredibly intense. And once I figured that out, I kind of loved it and just sort of joined in, and I felt like I wanted to be a robot, honestly, for the whole week. I trained like crazy in the months leading up to it. Obviously we did a bunch of testing, and then during the Le Mans week I just, you still had some of those old sponsor related responsibilities, and of course you've got family coming down and your phone's ringing with your mate wanting tickets and all of these things, and it got to about halfway through the week. I think we'd done one of the 2 qualifying days, and I just thought, sod it. The phone went off and I didn't turn it back on for another 3 or 4 days. till after the race, and that was the best thing I could have done because I could just focus. I did several track walks. I made sure that I knew absolutely every single inch of what is a pretty large racetrack. I knew, if I went off in the rain in the middle of the night, I'd know instinctively where to point the car to access an escape road. I'd know which bits of the gravel were deep, which bits were shallow. I'd know where there were drains and lumps and bumps and cambers in the road and crowns in the road, painted white lines to stay off if it was wet and so on. And I would sit in the car till late at night with my eyes closed, just reaching out for the various switches, just to, testing myself if I need to reach whatever it is, I don't know, change the engine map or something. Flat out in the middle of the night when you're maybe in a gaggle of other cars and you can't take your eyes off the road. Everything needs to be instinctive, and I did, and I just got to the point. I started the race. I felt calmer than I had ever felt at any of the previous outings because of that level of preparation, and it paid off. For my career, it would have been better to probably go into it thinking I need to, knock the socks off the lap times of my co-drivers. It's all about being the fastest driver on the squad over one lap. But anyone who knows Le Mans knows that that's a terrible idea. You're not a team player if you're doing that. You're not thinking about the long game. You're not thinking about the fact that you've got 24 hours to nurse a car through to get to the flag. So I changed my philosophy and I just decided I was going to be the one that didn't make any mistakes, and I would hope that I could complete the race at a good enough pace, so not to be embarrassing. And I didn't make any mistakes. My pace was pretty good, and I felt very comfortable in the car. And it got to the point where Darren and I did a lot of the heavy lifting through the night, and in the last couple of hours, all of our rival, the Peugeots mainly, I can't remember if the Audis were there, they must have been there, but the Peugeots were the real competition, and one by one they all failed. And so we went from running about from about 6th overall, and suddenly we're 5th, and then 4th, and then I did my final. I think it was a triple stint. Was my last scheduled block of running, to then hand over to Darren for the final stint, which was about 45 minutes, which felt great because he's a safe pair of hands. You've got that far. I was frankly just grateful not to have cocked it up. And so when you get the radio call saying, "Good job, Sam, pit this lap," you think, phew, I've got half a lap to get through, and I just hand it over and breathe a sigh of relief. And on that in lap, the engine let go. Oh. And suddenly, I'm looking in the mirror, there's flames and smoke, and I got as far as rolling to Arnage, and I finally had to pull over and park it. And there was about 40 minutes to go, and what I didn't realise until later, somebody told me, what a shame, you'd have been on the podium. And I thought, no, it wasn't a podium, we were 4th, I think, when we were 5th even. And I think briefly we were in 3rd. I don't actually know if that was because of pit stops, but whatever. To finish anywhere in the top 4, 5, 6 at Le Mans for a team like that, in a car like that, it's one of my favourite cars of all time. Great sound, great looks, great livery. That would have been quite nice.
That would have been amazing.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit annoyed about that.
Because it would be, given this is the RM Sotheby's podcast, it would be remiss of us not to mention that we've got an auction at Le Mans next year.
Absolutely.
It's the 100th running of the race next year, 2023, and we've got an auction, and what we're trying to do with that is, and we've already got 2 or 3 really great cars, but we want 24 cars, and we want 24 really historically significant Le Mans contenders. Not necessarily cars that have won, but cars that might have, maybe had got pole, or had run well in the race, or won their class or whatever, from across the decades. And it is, and when you look at the Le Mans and all of that history, you look at the 100 years of Le Mans history and all of the incredible moments and the incredible cars that have taken place. I mean, there's nothing like it, is there?
I think it's so special. There's so much depth to endurance racing, but particularly the heritage behind Le Mans and the history of that one race, that when you get into it, you just kind of get enraptured by this whole thing. When I was a kid, I couldn't care less about Le Mans. I was only focused on Formula One, and even into my teens, when I started racing cars, I only cared about single-seaters, and the idea that I might one day be a sports car driver was to say, forget about it, no thanks, I'd rather go and do something else. I mean, what a prat, what a complete prat. And I very quickly realised, just how awesome actually it really was, and thank God I managed to kind of hustle my way in there, because it gave me an entire career.
That's amazing. No, fantastic. And you can look back on that with some, real pride. And at what point, throughout that, how much interest, if any, did you have in historic racing and old cars, or were you completely focused on new machinery? How did you get involved in historic racing? Yeah. And at the point when you did, was that by accident, or was it something that you kind of had wanted to do anyway?
So my link to historic racing was through my dad, because, as I said earlier, he was doing a bit of club racing, classic single-seater stuff, but then he got more into the kind of Goodwoody kind of categories, and through his buddy Neil Twyman, I met our mutual buddy Joe Twyman, and I would say that Joe and his dad and the family, and certainly my dad, were completely 100% instrumental and responsible for helping me get into historic racing. And that all started when I think Dad was racing a Lotus 11 car that you're very familiar with.
Good choice.
And I had a few little goes in that. I remember coming from I think it was a Formula 3000 test at Snetterton, and I bombed it down to Goodwood in time for qualifying in this little Lotus 11. And my right foot was so accustomed to the brake pressure that you need in the Formula 3000 car. When I got to the end of the straight on my first sort of push lap, and I braked way too late and way too hard, I just spun this beautiful, perfect Lotus 11 that Neil Twyman and his guys had been fettling probably all year for that event. And I spun it through 360 degrees on the grass, and thank God ended up pointing in the right direction and praying that nobody spotted it, and learning my lesson very quickly about what a sort of a light touch you need to have with the controls of a historic race car. But I loved it, and very quickly after that I was fortunate to be invited into other cars. The Bamford family, obviously huge collectors, huge entrants. I was good friends with Joe Bamford, and he was racing some of their cars. I went along with him to many of the races to co-drive with him, help a little bit on the coaching side. And they actually one of the most enjoyable historic race weekends ever was Goodwood, I think in 2003, I think, where I raced their yellow GT40. I don't know if you guys remember that, but I just hadn't been in a historic car with that kind of power and that kind of balance, and it felt familiar, or somewhat familiar, to what I knew from
more contemporary.
Yeah, and so I could just lean on it, and it was a great car, very well prepared, and we got pole position, race win, and fastest lap of the whole meeting actually. And from that moment I thought, okay, I could get into this. That was really
well, and
fun.
of course it's results like that then get you noticed. And see, what's so annoying about you, Sam, is that you've done all of this incredible racing and you've not actually had to buy any of these cars, have you? Don't you find that's quite annoying, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I'd love that.
That has just changed last week actually.
Oh, has it?
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
another.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
well I'll ask you about that.
Yeah.
But right, okay, so now here you are, you've suddenly sort of found yourself in historic racing, and you're doing really well. So, I mean, what the amazing thing about historic racing is it's such a broad church, isn't it, in terms of, you know, pre-war car, you go and race an old pre-war car, and and that's sort of got that's an experience all of its own. And then, as you say, you've got powerful stuff, Can-Am cars, GT40s, and everything in between. So, reflecting now, I mean, you've been doing it a lot of years now, so reflecting back on all of the historics that you've raced, what is it, those sort of big banger, big capacity, powerful, is that what you love, or what?
To be honest, I love the variety. I don't really have a particular preference for one kind or another, because what I love about historic racing in general, and I've grown to learn about how important this facet is they all have a very low level of grip and bite. So you're kind of managing some form of a slide or drift all the time. And that's where the fun happens. So you can be in a Mini or something, a Lotus 11 has got fantastic balance, tiny skinny tyres.
Wheels like that, tyres like that. Yeah.
Not much power, but it's so much fun to find the limit and keep it there and be precise in a nimble little sports car like that. Just as it's great fun to hustle a Cobra, through the TT, which feels like a bucking Bronco by comparison. I love it all.
And I've sort of been, not so much as a competitor, but really through my upbringing as well, and Michael the same. I've sort of been around historic racing and a lot as a spectator. And it's changed a lot. And I think events like Goodwood, Goodwood and Monaco perhaps, they've changed the profile of historic racing in the sense that there are now so many more pros in it. Back in the day, if you'd gone to an historic race meet back in the 1980s, with one or two exceptions like Willie Green, but basically it was just a bunch of rank amateurs having a really, really good time. And it has obviously changed now, and I personally don't do a lot of races where there's a high pro quota on the grid. I know you Michael, you do the TT, don't you? And so you're out there. There's a very broad range of talents out there, and that presents I think it presents challenges on both sides. I think for the better drivers, you're trying to second guess what a less accomplished driver might be doing, and that can create issues. I think also it's naturally very intimidating for the non-pros, because they want to go out and enjoy their cars, and they have every right to do that. And I know, and maybe they have issues with the fact that they think I'm never going to do well in this race because I'm just surrounded by people that are getting paid to do it. Where do you sit with all that?
I think we need to be careful with historic racing about that. I don't want to do myself out of a job, and there is a clear divide in my mind between the need for pros in terms of the job that I mainly do as a driver coach is I'm there to coach. If it's an endurance race where two drivers are participating, sharing the car, I'm often one of the co-drivers, and that's fantastic because it allows the coaching process to go on through a race weekend. It's not confined only to test days, and you change from coaching items relating to going faster to items relating to racecraft and safety on track, how to conduct yourself among other people. And that's where I think the arrival of a few more pros over the past decade or so operating as coaches in the historic racing world is a really good thing, because there is and has been some appallingly crap driving over the years from amateurs who have the funding to buy their way into very quick cars, the combination of which can be and often is very dangerous. And to have a pro in that circumstance as a coach who can discreetly dial down the danger level and dial up the competence level is better for everyone.
I agree.
Where I think the line gets crossed, and where I think we do need to be a little bit careful, is where pros are hired as guns for hire, and it's nothing to do with coaching. It's nothing to do with anything really than just going out and trying to win. I love that, and I do think there's a place for it at some of the bigger events, Goodwood, perhaps some of the grids at Monaco and so on. But I do strongly believe that historic racing needs to remain all about the owners, who are largely amateur drivers. And remember, many of them are fantastically fast. And I know that the 1980s that you just referred to had fewer pros on the grid, but I would suggest that the peak level of pace at the sharp end of those grids in the 80s was no faster or slower than it is today. It's just there's more people able to do those lap times, and they all gather together at the big fancy events like Goodwood because it's the big deal. But I think all the dozens of other meetings in between those big blue ribbon events needs to remain absolutely about the amateurs. And so when an organisation like Masters slaps an elite driver penalty, which comes in the form of a depressingly extended long pit stop on a driver pairing that features a pro, I think that's absolutely right. It's exactly the way that the organisers and the historic racing world in general needs to keep sending a message to owners. We're here for you. We're not here for the pros.
Yeah. No, I think. I mean, where do you stand on that?
I think Sam's completely right. Like it's there
first
used to be a
time for
well-known
everything,
there used to be a well-known sort of restorer dealer that was always fielding cars with two pros in the car, and it did ruin those series that those cars ran in. Because it really meant that it was impossible for a guy who does a weekly job running a company or in the city or whatever, and then he's suddenly expected to be up against someone that's had a stellar pro career, and it actually just sort of it does take away from the enjoyment from that. And that you have to sort of ultimately, if you're at that end of the grid, you will be a competitive person. It's as simple as that. No one finds themselves there just by accident. And if you take away from that possibility of actually competing at that point, because it's just a sea of pro drivers, then the idea of sort of being a broad church just suddenly disappears. You're then another motorsport formula. And that's what it shouldn't be, because it's historic racing.
Absolutely. We need to be careful that we don't get carried away, because it's the historic racing version of the arms races that you've seen over the years in modern categories that have ultimately led to their demise, whether it be the super touring days of the BTCC or DTM or various iterations of GT racing over the years, where it's fantastic for a couple of years, but suddenly all the people that are the backbone of it disappear, because in historic racing, that's the owners. If ultimately too many owners decide not to enter an event because what's the point, the best I can finish is 8th because it's full of pros at the front, that series is not going to last very long. And all of us who are gleefully thinking, aren't we lucky, earning our living racing these nice cars on behalf of our clients, we're out of a job. That's pro drivers, that's preparers, that's race organisers. Everyone's done. So we have to be careful.
Absolutely, and I think we often say when we're talking about the market, how important events are in underpinning the market for cars, and not just racing, but there are lots of people that will go out and buy a Mark II Jag because they want something to go and park in the old car park at the Goodwood Revival, and that's kind of the reason why they're going out and buying that car. The events are really important, but in historic racing, you're absolutely right. I mean, these people that you go and spend a lot of money on a racing car because you want to have fun with it, and what you can't get around is that being competitive is part of that. A lot of it doesn't matter to everyone, but at least feeling that you can be competitive is where a lot of the fun comes from. If you can't be competitive, then you're not having fun, so what's the point? And
the thing is, there's actually, when you think about it, if you actually scan through a grid, and I'm not talking about an event like Goodwood where they deliberately try to gather as many pros as possible as part of the show, and that's a different concept and it makes total sense. But if you scan the grids at the others, there's actually not that many pros. No. There's plenty, though, of people operating at a pro level, and that's what I love about historic racing. And Michael, I mean, you're a perfect example of someone. Your lap times in a Cobra in the TT are, give or take plus or minus identical to mine. Depending on how much sleep I've had the night before. But you and I have had some
transponder.
We've had some great battles, and for me that's what historic racing is all about. It's I'm not suggesting for a minute that the driving level at the sharp end of the grid should be anything other than exceptional, bloody good. It should be really hard. And what I love about historic racing over here versus in the States is that's normal for us, particularly in the UK. I know that a lot of our European colleagues look at the way we race historic cars over here and they can't get their heads around it. But I love that. It should be flat out. We should be optimizing setups. I'm not suggesting that we start filling the cars with lots of sort of cheaty fancy components, but no one ever said you can't change a spring here and there and dial the dampers in or change the ride height or tire pressures or actually pay attention to that stuff, because you can be damn sure that Graham Hill did.
Yeah.
You know, so why shouldn't we?
Yeah.
And I think very often people moan about the rampant increase in development of these cars, the rampant reduction in lap times every year that we go back with an E-Type or a Cobra or whatever to Goodwood, and suddenly we're a bit quicker than 5 years ago. Well, yeah, guess what? You know, we've done some testing. What's wrong with that? That's part of it.
Going back to this 1980 period where I was really getting into it. I mean, you know, Patrick Lindsay, incredible driver, full-time, you know, chairman of Christie's Auction House. You know, he very definitely had a day job. Neil Corner very definitely had a day job that didn't involve racing cars, and yet, you know, these guys were absolutely phenomenal drivers. And you're right, I don't think, you know, if Patrick was out racing Remus today, he'd be as quick as anybody on that grid, even allowing for, you know, a few pro drivers being there. It may come as a surprise, Michael, to our listeners that there are some people that buy and sell old cars that are not RM Sotheby's.
I know, it's a shocker, isn't it?
I mean, I know, and you.
Anyone would contemplate not buying a car.
It's extraordinary that anyone would buy a car from anyone other than us. But Sam, you know, as your sort of career has developed, you race, you do driver coaching, and you also buy and sell cars. And you know, I think it's natural for a man of your experience that it's competition cars is really what you specialise in. So let's just talk a little bit about that. We're in an auction room. Actually, we've got some fabulous Group B cars behind us, and we've got a couple of Ferrari Challenge cars. How do you see the market, specifically in the world of historic racing cars? Is it buoyant? Are you seeing certain areas of the market growing and becoming, you know, a bigger part of where people are wanting to spend their money?
Certainly. So I've always thought that race cars are a bit more resilient to the ebb and flow that you see in the classic road car market, and I'm sure it's because it's underpinned by utility, these events, this amazing calendar of events that we're all able to have access to every single year for such a wide variety of competition cars, such a wide variety of owners, whether they be super capable and competitive or just amateurs that want to trundle around gently on a regularity section of a tour or something like that. And when you look at a calendar like that, the cars are the tantalising ticket to those events, which does seem to give the market for them some resilience, and that's definitely what I'm seeing. I mean, it sometimes, you know, a typical day at the moment, you read the news 1 minute and it's terrifying in terms of, you know, the economy and global affairs and so on, and then that same afternoon you sell a car or you source a car or you see a result or whatever it is and you think, wow, that just doesn't compute, and thank God for it. But I do think there's some logic there. I would have thought 6 months ago that we should have all started to get a little bit worried. I'm talking about the race car market, but actually I've seen the opposite. I've seen record prices, particularly for some categories. The GT1 category is going absolutely bananas, and for me all the writing is on the wall that is being considered the modern day version of the great 60s Grand Touring cars that make up the TT grid at Goodwood every year and have become worth many millions of dollars depending on which one you're talking about. And we're seeing the great cars from the late 90s and you know, sort of GT1 era, obviously having been led by the McLaren F1 into the stratosphere on values already for so many years, but everything else has sort of lagged behind. And I think people have woken up to the fact that GT1 was an extraordinary category of cars, championed by some of the greatest marques in the industry, producing beautiful shapes that are familiar enough to most onlookers to think, that's a Mercedes, that's a Porsche, recognize those headlights. And you've kind of got two tiers. You've got the top tier of the homologation specials, super limited production runs in the tens, not the sort of hundreds in terms of the quantities of chassis built. So we're seeing $10 million Porsche GT1 cars now becoming a normal thing. We're seeing similar numbers for Mercedes-Benz CLK GTRs. Which kind of nothing when you think of McLaren F1 actually, but they're all moving in that direction very quickly. 5 million euros for a Maserati MC12. Seemingly overnight, Ferrari 550 Maranellos, which obviously not so much of a homologation special. Ferrari made plenty of 550 road cars, but there were only a small handful that were
ProDrive cars
produced by ProDrive and went onto the world stage and just dominated everything. And it's a beautiful car. It sounds amazing. And a 550 Maranello ProDrive car is now sort of a £5 million car, history give or take. DBR9 Astons were the follow-on project for ProDrive immediately after the 550 program ended. So all of that knowledge, all of that experience was poured into Aston's DBR9 program. Just happened to be one of the most beautiful looking GT cars of all time. Also sounds amazing, does a very similar job to the Ferrari, but because it's not a Ferrari but it still is an Aston, the values of those were just a little bit delayed, and DBR9 values are now rampantly catching up with the Ferraris, because I sort of think people that look at the two and go, well hang on, the Aston's not half a 550, it dominated Le Mans, Sebring, won everything at the same time, and it's just as beautiful. Yes, okay, we'll give the Ferrari badge a little bit of a bump, a bit of a premium, but it's not double. So what was a £1.5 million DBR9 is now 2 or 3 or 4 depending on which car it is, and it just seems to be a rising tide. And the nice thing about it is that while it's not alone as being a subsection of the race car market that seems to be having its moment in the sun, there are others. 1990s Formula One cars are having a very nice time at the moment, again because people out there have got themselves together, organised a calendar of events where you can't race them yet, but we all grew up loving 1990s F1, naturally aspirated 3 and 3.5 litre engines, wide tyres, wide track cars, clean body work, iconic liveries, all the drivers that are heroes, and no one more than me wants to see a race series created in the near future for those. But unfortunately, two things hold the values back of those kind of cars compared to things like the GT1s we were talking about, and that is the physical size of the cockpits. Tiny, and it eliminates a vast proportion of the potential audience.
I'm all right.
Yeah,
you
I know.
too. Forget about it.
Yeah, I'm very jealous.
One of my shoes.
You'd be fine.
Well, I just don't have the money, but I'll fit.
Michael and I would be like giraffes, peering out the top like a periscope.
Right in front of the airbox.
And the other thing is, F1 is intimidating. For an amateur audience, which it largely is, a Formula One car is a scary thing. And even if they're not that scared of it, and even if they do fit, when you actually drive them, if you go and speak to some of the current owners who are amateurs that did get on the train early and have enjoyed some outings in their very special Williams or McLarens or Ferraris or whatever, 3 to 6 laps, they are knackered and they're nowhere near achieving or exploiting the full performance potential of those cars. So yes, it's an amazing bucket list item and box to have ticked, but in terms of a wider audience looking to cars that excite them, that they're not intimidated by, that they can fit physically and comfortably into, and that are gentle enough to accommodate the lesser experience of an amateur driver, but capable enough to accommodate somebody that's become really quick and does have a lot of experience. GT1 just seems to hit the sweet spot, so that's flying at the moment. And because it's part of the same grid, the LMP categories from the late 90s through to sort of as recently as 2016 even are all enjoying a lift as well. And again, it's just because Peter Auto, with Jared Venables' help, have created a fantastic series, the Endurance Legends grid for these prototypes and the GT cars. And then Ron Maiden with Masters Endurance Legends doing something very similar, but accommodating younger cars in that as well.
And so do you think that the rise in the appeal of some of these sort of what let's call the modern era race cars, I know that's a pretty broad term in its own right, but do you think that that may be having any kind of a negative impact on cars from other eras? So I don't know, I'm just going to spout a little bit, that somebody that had a sum of money that perhaps 10 years ago would have bought them a D-Type Jag, let's just say, as a great historic sports racing car. Do you think that that money is potentially now going into other things at the expense potentially of, say, 1950s sports racing cars? Or is it, or, you know,
I feel like 90s stuff has taken some sort of what would have been incoming money away from stuff like Group C.
Right.
You know, but that's not at the top level of Group C. So great 956s, Sauber C9s, C11s, you know, stuff like that. You know, they're not really affected by that because they're not cars that people are going to particularly buy to go and compete in. At the same time,
a Rondo or something.
A Neil Thompson, a Thompson Tub
962.
962, or you know, Richard Lloyd Racing 962. Something I love because of the history of Richard Lloyd, stuff like that. But actually, that's a race car, and 90s stuff is on in some ways cheaper to run. It is more user friendly for an amateur driver because it was more designed for that.
Yeah.
You know, so it has channeled that sort of interest slightly further towards the 90s,
I think it's
2000s
diluted
grid.
for drivers interested in fast cars
Yeah.
that maybe did previously do Group C, and prior to that maybe did the
Can-Am maybe.
Can-Am stuff, or the C, you know, Matra, for example, you know, from CER, Classic Endurance Racing with Peter Auto. You know, maybe some of that audience has been distracted into the younger stuff. But I think as long as Goodwood exists, there will always be a market for the D-types of this world.
Yeah, absolutely. What we try to do sometimes on these podcasts, Sam, is just fire some. I'm just going to fire some questions at you, and don't overthink the answer. Just what comes into your head.
Do I have final editing rights over there? So I have no idea.
Yeah, you know, we're not going out live. So, best car you've ever driven?
Road car or race car?
Either.
Race car, Ferrari 333 SP. Road car, probably a Ferrari F40. In terms of pure driving pleasure, not ultimate lap time performance.
Okay. Worst race car.
Worst race car.
I mean, it could be worse because
Can't think of a
it's
bad
not very
one.
good, or maybe because it was just a really hard car to master.
You were supposed to drive the AMR1, weren't you? But that was never delivered.
I never
So
drove.
maybe
it.
that's the.
I was involved in sort of the wooden buck design and the cockpit layout and stuff. No, I would love to have driven it, but
Yeah.
I think that's actually a good car. It just didn't have the horsepower.
Didn't have the
Worst race car. I drove an Allard. I think it was a J2X once at Le Mans Classic that had literally been wheeled out of a museum basically the day before and put onto the grid, and it looked like the wheels were falling off it as it just sat there still, and it felt very much like the wheels were falling off. So yeah, that was pretty horrendous. Yeah,
Fair enough.
even though they're otherwise good cars when they're well prepared.
Can be very competitive at J2X.
Yeah,
can't it?
sure.
You're going to buy one car. You're not going to buy this for investment. It's just because you love it, and it's going to stay in your garage forever. What are you going to buy?
Road or race car?
Race car.
Race car. It would probably be a sort of Xena McLaren MP44 or something.
Would it now? Okay. You've got quite. You've got a bigger budget than I
champagne
thought.
tasted lemonade pockets. I think.
One race car's having your garage forever. What are you buying?
Oh my god. I have my dad's Cobra.
Job done. Okay, fine.
In my purchase, I need a sort of bit of magic fairy dust to make me just shrink to be half the size so I can at least drive this thing.
Well,
Otherwise I'm just gonna have to look at it or call you. You could be my pro.
Hey, just buy the stuff.
Can I afford you?
I'm a phone call away.
You go.
Oh yeah,
Okay,
you can
cool.
afford. You can 100%. You can. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you, Sam.
Not at all. Thanks for
It's
having
been
me.
a real pleasure talking to you. Really informative. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
And I think we'll wrap that up there. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us on the RM Sotheby's Car Show here in London. If you want to listen to the full extended episode of our interview with Sam, please do that by downloading the podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube now, it exists as a podcast. Go to all of the usual places where you download podcasts and you will find it there, and there's a whole load more content there. Thank you very much.